In this video series, I'm going to explain the fast story development process. Once you understand and master this simple process, you'll be able to turn pretty much any idea into a detailed, original story in about an hour. In part one, this video right here, I'm going to explain the hidden story dynamic that's underneath absolutely every aspect of every project you ever create. It's the simple secret to extraordinary stories. When I started looking for screenplays to produce, I quickly discovered that there are a lot of good ideas out there, but there are astonishingly few great stories, and even fewer great screenplays. Now, since my goal was to make up to 6 films a year, that's a problem. I mean, producers can't make great movies until we first have great stories. But how do we turn that good idea into a great story? Well, I believe it's always best to start at the end, to identify your goal, imagine the result you want, and then design for that outcome. So if our big picture target is a great story, we need to first start by asking, well, what makes a story great? A great story engages the audience by taking them on a compelling journey from point A to point B in a satisfying way. All right, so how do we turn your idea into one? Well, the approach most people take is to use a story formula. In the screenwriting world, one formula has become almost a religion. So let's cover that first. It's called the 3-act structure, and it basically breaks every story into 3 parts: beginning, middle, and end, or setup, conflict, resolution. If you divide your story into roughly 4 quarters, the first quarter is Act 1, the middle 2 quarters are Act 2, and the last quarter is Act 3. In the first act, we introduce the main character in their normal life, when something happens to them, forcing them to respond and setting them on a new path. Then, about 25% of the way into your story, at the end of Act 1, something happens that spins the story in a whole new direction. This is known as plot point 1, or the first act twist. It gives your character a goal which they'll pursue throughout Act 2. But as they pursue that goal, obstacles get in their way. The obstacles increase in strength and power. They get harder and more challenging throughout the second act, demanding more and more out of your character, until something happens about 75% of the way through your story at the end of Act 2, plot point 2, that spins the story in a new direction, which shows your character what they must do to resolve the story. Usually it requires going head-to-head against the primary opponent. The third act then builds to that final story climax, where the battle ensues and they either win or lose, and we see the consequences of the events of the story. Now, you can probably pause this video right here and start turning your idea into a story from that formula alone, but there's a problem with this formula. The human mind is designed to recognize patterns. So if we made 6 films a year that follow the same identical structure, we're going to churn out increasingly boring, predictable films that an audience is uninterested in. They won't be satisfying, that key component to a great story. See, formula is great for deconstructing existing stories, but how do we create something original, something truly new that's also effective for an audience? To answer that question, I started to dig a little bit deeper underneath the formula, to try to figure out what actually makes it work. And what I discovered was this hidden story dynamic, a mechanism underlying the structure. And that is setup and payoff. Now, the setup-payoff dynamic is very well known on a micro level. Jokes or scenes or elements within your story where the setup establishes the context or the situation and the payoff spins it or offers something unexpected or ties things together in some way. But my breakthrough was in realizing that the setup-payoff dynamic is actually the core building block under every aspect of your story. Everything in your story is either setup or payoff or both, where it pays off one thing as it sets up another. Think about it. When we say that a story has holes in it, it means that things were set up that were never actually paid off, or something was paid off that wasn't really set up properly. So if we look at the 3-act structure again, the acts are really just setups and payoffs. At the beginning of the story, we set up the character until we pay off that initial setup, which spins the story in a new direction and sets up the payoff that will happen at the end of the second act, which then sets up the final climax of the story. The climax itself is the payoff for literally everything that has happened along the way. Ultimately, story itself is really just a complex web of interlocking setups and payoffs. Which means we can use the setup-payoff dynamic to create a 1-act structure story, or 2-act structures, or even 7 acts, or multiple storyline structures. With this building block, you could even invent your own structure, something completely original we've never even seen before, that's uniquely perfect for your idea. The human mind recognizes patterns, so when the formula works, it's because we recognize the pattern, but it's satisfying in some way, usually through some sort of twist or just a really enjoyable experience. With this dynamic, you can create new patterns that are equally as satisfying. But you know what? It doesn't even stop there, because my real epiphany is that the setup-payoff dynamic is scalable. It's not just about story structure. This dynamic applies to absolutely everything, from characters to dialogue to scenes to pacing and the elements of your story. You can zoom in and use it on the micro level as an analysis tool to find cliches and predictable story choices. Those are simply the most obvious payoffs for what you've set up. Or improve and strengthen your story details, like making character or dialogue or setting choices that connect with the rest of the story. Or discover the holes in your story and fill them by looking for setups that haven't been paid off, or vice versa. Or you can zoom out and use it on a macro level as a creativity tool to expand and flesh out your ideas by imagining new or unexpected or more satisfying payoffs. Or generate new ideas. If you think of your ideas themselves as either setup or payoff, your imagination can run in whole new directions. Or brainstorm better ideas by going beyond what a reader or audience might automatically imagine or anticipate. And by using this tool at the broadest level and the narrowest level, you can create truly original stories that both engage the audience and satisfy them. Because the simple secret to extraordinary stories is that everything is interconnected. In great stories, everything is either setup or payoff or both. But you know what? If you really stop and think about it, this dynamic is underneath absolutely everything. You've got an idea, you want to turn it into a story. Point A, point B, setup, payoff. So in part 2 of this video, I'm going to show you how I've used this dynamic as a story development tool. So you can literally start with an idea and grow it organically into a detailed, original story. Feel free to ponder the contents of this video, explore your stories and your ideas, maybe the movies you watch through this filter, and then join us in part 2 when you're ready. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you there.